The sea was restless, an endless stretch of gray and green that seemed to swallow the horizon. The wooden ship creaked and groaned as it sliced through the Atlantic swells, its sails straining against the wind. Salt water sprayed across the deck, stinging the eyes and lips of the passengers who huddled together for warmth. It was July of 1587, and the voyage had already felt like a lifetime. For many of the men, women, and children aboard, this was their first glimpse of the new world. For others, it was a return to a place that carried whispers of failure. John White stood near the bow, his gloved hands resting on the weathered railing as he peered through the mist. He was a man of measured composure, but the lines on his face told of the strain this mission had already placed upon him. He had been chosen as the governor of this new colony, an honor that carried the weight of countless lives. Behind him, he could hear the nervous murmurs of settlers. Their voices carried questions they dared not ask aloud. What awaited them on the other side of this ocean? Would the soil yield food? Would the native tribes welcome them, tolerate them, or see them as invaders? The ship's crew, hardened from years at sea, shouted commands as the coastline came into view. Ahead lay Roanoke Island, a stretch of land along the outer banks of what we now call North Carolina. But in 1587, it was simply wilderness, a dense tangle of towering pines, oaks, and underbrush, broken only by sandy inlets and the dark shadows of unknown creatures lurking just beyond sight. The island was surrounded by shallow, shifting channels that could easily wreck a ship that misjudged its path. The colonists had been told that this would be their promised land, a place where they could plant roots for England in the New World. They numbered 115, 90 men, 17 women, and 11 children. Ordinary families seeking new opportunities. Among them was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, pregnant with her first child. He kept glancing at her as the ship drew closer, his stomach tightening with worry. She was young, not yet 20, and the journey had been hard on her. The cramped quarters below deck had made it nearly impossible to rest. But she stood straight now, one hand resting on her belly, as if determined to show strength in the face of uncertainty. The ship anchored in the Sound, and rowboats ferried settlers and supplies ashore. The landing was awkward and tense. The colonists' boots sank into the wet sand as they stepped onto the island for the first time, the humid air clinging to their clothes. They looked around at the dense forest pressing in from every side. The chirping of unseen birds echoed through the trees, mingled with the occasional distant rustle that suggested something larger was moving just out of sight. White led the way inland toward the site of the previous settlement. 2 years earlier, Sir Richard Grenville had left a garrison of English soldiers at Roanoke, only for them to disappear or be driven away. What White and his group found now was a grim reminder of that failure. The fortifications had rotted and collapsed in places. The houses were little more than charred timber and broken thatch. Overgrown vines had twisted their way through gaps in the wooden palisade, as though the land itself was reclaiming what had been abandoned. The sight unsettled the settlers. Whispers passed between them as they rebuilt the fort walls and repaired the houses, though their efforts were crude at best. White could feel the weight of their unease pressing down on him. He tried to project confidence, organizing work details and assigning roles, but the island felt hostile.
The trees seemed to watch them. Every night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned black, The colonists could hear distant sounds, the crackle of twigs, the low murmur of voices carried by the wind. Trade with the local tribes was White's immediate priority. The Algonquian-speaking peoples of the region had complex alliances and rivalries that the English did not fully understand. At first, White approached them with gifts of beads, tools, and cloth, hoping to secure their cooperation. Some tribes accepted these gestures, offering maize and fish in return. But others remembered how the English had treated their people 2 years earlier. Grenville's men had burned entire villages over minor disputes. Trust was a fragile commodity. The settlers' fear deepened after a tragic mistake. Believing they were retaliating against a hostile group, a party of colonists launched a nighttime raid on a native village. But the people they attacked were allies, not enemies. The error cost them dearly. The once friendly tribes now regarded the English with suspicion, if not outright hostility. Food supplies dwindled. The settlers had brought seed and livestock, but the sandy soil was poor for farming, and their small herds were quickly exhausted. Hunting offered little relief. The forest was vast and unfamiliar, and the animals were elusive. By late August, it was clear they could not survive the winter without help. John White wrestled with the decision he now faced, whether to leave the colony and return to England for supplies. He knew what it meant. If he left, he would be abandoning his daughter and grandchild in a precarious situation. But if he stayed, they all might starve. The settlers pleaded with him to go, their voices raw with desperation. Eleanor, tears shining in her eyes, urged him to make the journey. "You must come back. You must," she whispered as they embraced at the water's edge. White boarded the ship and watched as the island receded behind him, the figures of his loved ones growing smaller until they vanished into the horizon. He promised himself he would return quickly, but he could not have known how impossible that promise would become. England was at war. By the time White reached home, the Spanish Armada was preparing to launch its massive assault on the English coast. Queen Elizabeth I demanded every available ship for defense. White pleaded with officials to let him return to Roanoke, but his requests were repeatedly denied. Months stretched into years. The Atlantic, which had once been a mere obstacle, now became a wall. Finally, in the summer of 1590, John White secured passage on a privateer vessel. He was older now, his hair streaked with gray, his body weakened by stress and guilt. As the ship approached Roanoke once again, storms lashed the coast, tearing at the sails and driving sheets of rain across the deck. But White's heart surged with hope. He imagined Eleanor waiting for him at the palisade, Virginia Dare, now 3 years old, running into his arms. He would bring them food, tools, reinforcements. He would set things right. But when they reached the island, there was only silence. White stepped ashore and walked through the familiar gate of the fort. The houses were empty, their roofs caved in. Tools lay scattered where they had been left years earlier. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no bodies. It was as if the settlers had simply vanished. Then White saw the carving. On one tree, near the entrance to the fort, the word Croatoan had been etched deep into the bark. Nearby, 3 letters, C-R-O, were carved into another post. The sight filled White with cautious relief. Before he left, he had instructed the colonists to carve the name of their destination if they were forced to move. If they were in danger, they were to add a cross as a sign of distress. There was no cross.
White believed they had relocated peacefully to Croatoan Island, home to a friendly tribe they had once relied upon for food. But a storm was gathering offshore, and the ship's captain refused to risk the treacherous waters. White begged for just a few more days, but the crew was resolute. They weighed anchor and set sail, leaving the governor behind with his unanswered questions. He would never see the colony again. The ship's sails disappeared on the horizon as the wind carried it away from Roanoke Island. Those left behind stood at the shoreline, watching the last traces of their connection to England vanish. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic wash of waves against the sand. Eleanor Dare wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but for comfort. Virginia, her infant daughter, stirred in her swaddling, unaware of the enormity of what had just happened. John White had promised he would return soon, laden with food and tools. The settlers wanted to believe him, but even the most optimistic among them felt a shadow settle over their hearts as the Atlantic swallowed the ship whole. The days immediately following White's departure were filled with a strained determination. The settlers threw themselves into work, as if keeping busy would stave off the creeping dread. They repaired the palisade walls and strengthened the gate, fortifying the settlement against any possible attacks. Men ventured deeper into the forest to hunt, their muskets clutched tightly in clammy hands, while others fished the nearby waters. The women tended the small garden plots that struggled to yield meager crops. But the soil was poor, sandy, and uncooperative, and it became clear that they would need outside help if they were to survive the winter. They attempted to renew trade with the surrounding tribes, but relations were strained. Rumors had already spread that the English had attacked an allied village by mistake weeks earlier. When the settlers approached the neighboring tribes with offers of beads and tools, they were met with suspicion. In some cases, they were met with silence. Native scouts would appear at the edges of the forest, watching with unreadable expressions, only to vanish into the underbrush without word. Tensions inside the colony began to grow. There was no single clear leader now that White was gone, and disagreements over food distribution and labor flared. An outspoken settler named George Hoe believed they needed to abandon Roanoke altogether and seek out Croatoan Island, where the friendly Croatoan tribe might help them survive. Others argued that leaving the fort would expose them to greater danger. Eleanor, though reluctant to voice her opinion, wanted to believe her father would return, and that they needed to stay where he would find them. As August gave way to September, the signs of hunger began to show. Children cried through the night with empty bellies. Adults tried to mask their own gnawing hunger, sacrificing portions of their meager meals to feed the youngest among them. Hunting parties returned with little to show for their efforts. The larger animals seemed to avoid the island entirely, and the rabbits and birds they managed to trap could not feed so many mouths. The fish, too, were scarce. The island's creeks and tidal flats were unpredictable, their bounty dependent on shifting currents and luck. Then came the first disappearance. It was just after dawn when Thomas Dymoke, a young man barely in his 20s, was found missing from his bed. At first, the settlers assumed he had gone out early to check his traps, but by midday he had not returned. Search parties fanned out through the forest, calling his name, but the only answer they received was the rustle of wind through the trees. By nightfall, his trail had vanished.
The settlers whispered theories. Had he wandered too far and gotten lost? Had one of the tribes captured him? Or had he run away entirely, choosing the uncertain wilderness over the slow death of starvation? The unease deepened with each passing day. At night, strange sounds echoed from the forest, low, distant drums that seemed to throb through the earth itself. Voices carried on the wind, soft and indistinct, as though dozens of people were murmuring just beyond the tree line. Some settlers claimed to see figures moving in the shadows, tall, lean silhouettes slipping between the trees. Others dismissed these sightings as tricks of the moonlight, but the fear was contagious. Eleanor Dare tried to keep hope alive for the sake of her daughter. She told Virginia stories of England, of green hills and blooming gardens, of a life she might one day see. But as the nights grew colder and the food stores dwindled, Eleanor could feel her own hope eroding. Each morning she would walk to the palisade and scan the horizon for sails. Each evening she returned with nothing to report. One particularly harsh night in late September, a storm swept across the island. Rain lashed the settlement, soaking the settlers to the bone as they huddled together for warmth. The wind howled through the trees, bending the pines like matchsticks. The following morning, they discovered that one of their storage sheds had collapsed, destroying much of their already limited food supply. The disaster sent ripples of panic through the colony. George Howard pressed his case once again. They could not wait for White any longer. "Every day we stay here is a death sentence," he told the others, his voice hoarse from the cold. "We must move. Croatoan Island is only a day's journey by boat. If the Croatans will take us in, we may survive. If we stay here—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. A vote was held, though it was far from unanimous. Some believed that White would keep his promise and return, perhaps any day now. Others believed they were clinging to a fantasy. In the end, it was decided that they would send a small scouting party to Croatoan Island to assess the situation. If the Croatans were willing to help, the rest of the settlers would follow. The scouting party set out under a pale gray sky. They were supposed to return by nightfall, but when darkness descended, there was no sign of them. The settlers waited by the water's edge, torches held high, calling their names across the black waves. The only answer was the lapping of water against the shore. The following morning, another group went to search for the missing scouts. They returned at dusk with a single discovery. One of the boats, half submerged in a tidal creek miles from the colony. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, just a gash in the hull where the wood had splintered. The settlers were left with more questions than answers. By October, the colony was unraveling. Hunger and fear had freed tempers, and arguments turned into fistfights. Some settlers slipped away in the night, leaving the fort behind in search of food or safety elsewhere. Most never returned. Eleanor kept Virginia close at all times. She had begun to notice that even in the daylight, the forest seemed wrong. Once, while gathering firewood just outside the palisade, she thought she heard someone breathing behind her. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was no one there, just the stillness of the trees, the faint rustle of leaves. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight vanished behind the horizon, the settlers heard something that froze their blood, the distant sound of children crying. The voices seemed to come from the forest, thin and plaintive, carried on the wind. Mothers clutched their children close while the men stood guard at the palisade, muskets ready. The crying continued for hours, rising and falling like waves until it faded into the night. The next morning, they found tracks near the edge of the forest, bare footprints, small as if left by children. They led deep into the underbrush and then vanished. The settlers debated whether the sounds had been a cruel trick by one of the tribes or something else entirely. No one could explain it, but no one slept soundly after that night. As the winter approached, the settlers faced a terrible choice. To stay meant near certain death by starvation. To leave meant venturing into the unknown with no guarantee of shelter or aid. The council gathered round the dying embers of the communal fire and debated long into the night. In the end, they decided they could wait no longer. Before abandoning the fort, they agreed to leave a message for John White should he return. They would carve the name of their destination into the fort's gate. If they were in danger, they would add a cross to signal distress. It was a plan born of desperation, but it was all they had. Eleanor knelt by the firelight that night, Virginia asleep in her lap, and listened as the settlers prepared to leave the only home they had known in the New World. She tried to imagine her father returning to find the fort empty, reading the message they would leave behind. She wondered if he would understand, if he would follow. The next morning, the carving began. The pale light of dawn seeped through the trees as the settlers gathered round the gate of the fort. The air was thick with a mist that clung to their clothes and hair, soaking through as if the island itself wanted to hold them back. Every face in the crowd was drawn with exhaustion, their eyes hollowed by weeks of hunger and sleepless nights. Yet there was purpose in their movements. They had made their decision. George Howe stepped forward, a crude knife in his hand, and began to carve the message into the timber post of the palisade. Each letter was deliberate, gouged deep enough to withstand time and weather. Croatoan. The rhythmic scrape of the blade echoed in the silence. Beside him, Eleanor Dare clutched her daughter Virginia tightly, rocking her gently as she slept, unaware of the gravity of the moment. Some of the settlers whispered prayers under their breath, asking for protection on the journey ahead. The plan was simple in theory, dangerous in practice. They would abandon the safety of the fort and travel by boat and foot to Croatoan Island, hoping that the Croatoan tribe would shelter them. Some argued they should split into smaller groups to increase their chances of survival, but Howe insisted they needed to stay together. "We've lost too many already," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "If we scatter, none of us will make it." The settlers packed what little they had left, tools, weapons, a few blankets, and the remnants of their food supply. They secured the boats they had salvaged from earlier trips and loaded them with children and the weakest among them. The rest would follow on foot along the coastal routes. The island's forest closed in on either side as they moved, the branches above forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of waves lapping at the shore and the occasional cry of a child. The settlers' footsteps left faint impressions in the sand that the tide slowly erased behind them, as if the earth itself wanted to erase their presence. The journey was harder than they had imagined. The terrain was treacherous, forcing them to wade through tidal creeks and scramble over dunes. They had to ration every crumb of food, every sip of water. By the second night, the mood had grown tense. The children were crying from hunger, and the adults were too tired to soothe them. That night, as they huddled around a small fire in the dunes, they heard the sound again. The faint, distant drums, the same ominous rhythm they had heard back at the fort, pulsing through the darkness like a heartbeat. George Howe ordered everyone to stay close, muskets at the ready, but no one approached. The settlers sat in silence, the flames casting long shadows across their weary faces, waiting for something they could not name. At dawn, one of the boats was missing. It had been tied securely with the others, but now only the frayed end of the rope remained, trailing into the surf. There was no sign of the family who had been sleeping beside it. Their footprints led a short distance up the beach before vanishing into the dense brush. Some argued they should search for the missing group, but Howe refused. "We can't lose more time," he said. "If we don't reach Croatoan soon, we'll all die." The words hung in the salty air, a truth no one wanted to acknowledge. They pressed on. As they traveled, they began to notice signs that they were being watched. Broken branches, fresh footprints in the sand that didn't belong to any of them. Shadows flickering at the edge of the tree line, gone when they turned to look. One man, Henry Colburn, claimed he had seen a figure in the forest, a tall, gaunt shape draped in animal skins, its face painted white with black eyes like hollow pits. But when they searched the area, there was nothing there. The group grew smaller each day. Some collapsed from exhaustion and could not be roused. Others slipped away in the night, leaving behind their few possessions. A few bodies were found in the morning, cold and still. The settlers dug shallow graves in the sand when they could, but more often they had to leave the dead behind, their names whispered into the wind as the group moved on. Eleanor Dare felt herself slipping into despair. Virginia's cries grew weaker each day, and Eleanor had little milk left to give her. At night, she wrapped her daughter in a worn blanket and whispered stories of England, of fields and rivers and skies untouched by fear. She knew the child could not understand, but the sound of her own voice was the only thing keeping her sane. By the third week, they were nearing Croatoan Island, but the journey had taken a toll. The boats they had brought were barely seaworthy, their hulls patched with strips of cloth and sap. Crossing the channel to the island would be dangerous, but they had no choice. The settlers worked tirelessly to ready the boats, patching holes and bailing water. That night, they set up camp along the shore, preparing to make the crossing at dawn. The moon was high when Eleanor awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her tent. She froze, clutching Virginia to her chest. Through the thin fabric, she could see the shadow of someone moving past, slow and deliberate. She waited, her breath shallow, until the figure vanished. When she stepped outside a moment later, the beach was empty. But at the edge of the forest, she could just make out a line of footprints leading away from the camp, too large to belong to any of the children. The crossing began at first light. The boats pushed off one by one, their occupants silent with fear as they rowed into the misty channel. The current was strong, threatening to pull them off course, and the boats creaked under the weight of so many bodies. Eleanor sat in the middle of one vessel, clutching Virginia close as the water lapped against the. She kept her eyes fixed on the dark outline of Croatoan Island ahead, willing it to stay in view. Halfway across, a scream tore through the fog.
One of the boats had capsized, throwing its passengers into the freezing water. Men dove in to pull them out, but the current was merciless. Eleanor could hear the thrashing and cries for help, but she couldn't see through the thick mist. When the survivors finally reached the opposite shore, 4 people were missing, swept away by the tide. The Croatans greeted them cautiously. The tribe had long been friendly to the English, but they were wary of newcomers, especially so many. Their chief listened as George Howe explained their plight, his voice trembling with desperation. He offered gifts of tools and cloth, but the chief shook his head. They had little food themselves and could not take in so many mouths. It was a devastating blow. The settlers begged to be allowed to stay, at least until John White returned, but the Croatans would not relent. "If you remain here," the chief warned through a translator, "you will bring death to us all." That night, the settlers gathered on the beach, their spirits broken. Some argued they should try to return to the fort, others that they should move inland and seek another tribe for help. But none of the options promised survival. Eleanor sat apart from the others, holding Virginia as the child drifted in and out of sleep. She could feel the fever in her daughter's small body, could hear the rasp of her shallow breaths. At dawn, a storm rolled in from the Atlantic, battering the shore with wind and rain. The settlers scrambled to secure their boats, but several were ripped from their moorings and dashed against the rocks. The few that remained were barely functional. The group was forced to make a decision: stay on Croatoan Island, risking the anger of the tribe, or push further inland into territory none of them knew. In the end, they chose to leave. The storm pounded the shore of Croatoan Island with unrelenting force, tearing at the settlers' camp like it meant to erase their very existence. Sheets of rain swept across the beach, soaking everything in seconds. Waves crashed higher and higher, dragging driftwood and debris onto the sand. The few remaining boats were pulled inland by frantic hands, their hulls creaking as they were wedged into the dunes for safety. But Eleanor Dare knew the storm was a sign. They could not stay here. The Croatoans had made it clear. They had given the settlers a day's shelter, a few scraps of smoked fish and dried maize, but their village was too small to feed so many strangers any longer, and the Croatoans feared the English would become a burden they could not sustain. The chief's words echoed in Eleanor's mind even now, his face stern but not unkind. "If you remain here, you will bring death to us all." When the storm finally broke, the settlers stood on the soaked beach, water dripping from their ragged clothes. The Croatoans watched silently from a distance, their faces unreadable. They had made their decision, and it was final. George Howe gathered the group, his voice strained but steady. "We cannot return to the fort," he said. "There is nothing left for us there but starvation. We must go inland." He gestured toward the dense wilderness that stretched beyond the beach, a labyrinth of pine forests and swampy lowlands. "We'll find another tribe, one that will take us in. We must try." The settlers had no better plan. They began the trek inland, leaving behind the shore and the faint hope of John White's return. The forest swallowed them whole. Tall trees rose overhead like ancient sentinels, their thick canopies filtering the light into dim green shadows.
The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. The journey was agonizing. They waded through waist-deep marshes where leeches clung to their legs. They hacked through undergrowth with dull hatchets, their progress slow and exhausting. Every step took them further from the coast, further from any chance of rescue. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly. Their food stores were almost gone, and hunting yielded little. The men set crude snares for rabbits and birds, but days would pass without a catch. When they did manage to trap an animal, the meat was divided into portions so small it barely eased the hunger. Children cried at night, their thin voices like whispers in the dark. The group began to splinter. Arguments broke out over direction, over food, over who should lead. Some blamed George Ho for persuading them to leave the fort. Others whispered that they should never have trusted the Croatoans, that perhaps the tribe had cursed them when they refused to stay. By the second week, the first group broke away. A dozen settlers, convinced that they would fare better on their own, left in the night without a word. Their absence was discovered at dawn, along with one of the muskets and a small supply of food. Eleanor watched as the remaining group debated whether to follow them. Ho shook his head. "They've sealed their own fate," he said grimly. As the days passed, Eleanor's fear grew. Virginia was weak, her body too small to endure the journey. Eleanor carried her constantly, whispering to her, singing softly as they trudged through the forest. She thought of her father every day, of the promise he had made. Would he return to the fort and find only emptiness? Would he understand the message they had carved into the gate? One night, as they camped in a small clearing, the settlers heard something moving in the darkness. Muskets were raised, torches lit, but the forest revealed nothing.
The next morning, one of the children was missing. His blanket was found at the edge of the camp, soaked with dew, but there was no sign of him. The settlers searched for hours, calling his name until their voices broke, but he was gone. That was the turning point. The sense of dread that had stalked the group since leaving the fort now took hold completely. They began to move faster, desperate to find safety, but the wilderness offered none. Some nights they found abandoned huts or traces of old campsites, but no living souls. Other tribes seemed to avoid them deliberately, their scouts appearing briefly in the distance before melting back into the forest. By the third week inland, sickness had set in. The settlers were malnourished and exhausted, their immune systems failing. Fevers swept through the group, claiming the weakest first. Graves became shallow and hurried, the earth too hard to dig deeply. Eleanor knelt by each one, clutching Virginia to her chest, her tears soaking the child's hair. George Howe tried to maintain order, but he was unraveling. His once commanding voice had grown hoarse, his frame gaunt from hunger. One evening he called the group together and admitted the truth. He had no idea where they were going. "We are lost," he said simply. The next morning, Howe was gone. His bedroll was empty, his musket missing. No one knew if he had abandoned them or wandered off in despair. The settlers stood in stunned silence, realizing that they were now leaderless, drifting through a wilderness that seemed determined to consume them. With no direction, smaller groups began to break away. Families clung together, hoping they might find help by striking out alone. Eleanor was begged by one group to join them, but she refused. She had promised herself she would not abandon the others. She stayed with the dwindling group, though she knew in her heart that every path led to the same end.
One by one, they vanished. Some died from fever and were buried beneath makeshift crosses of wood. Others simply disappeared, slipping away at night or wandering off during the day. Eleanor began to lose track of the days, her world narrowing to the sound of Virginia's breathing and the constant ache in her stomach. One night, the crying began again, the same eerie sound they had heard back at the fort, children's voices calling softly from the darkness. Eleanor clutched Virginia tightly, her eyes wide as she scanned the tree line. She knew it was impossible. There were no children left in the group except her own daughter. Yet the voices persisted, weaving through the trees like threads of smoke. When morning came, the settlers found more footprints around the camp, bare feet, small and delicate, leading away into the forest. Eleanor felt a cold dread settle over her heart. She wondered if the forest was alive, if it was luring them deeper, waiting for the moment when none of them would be left. By now, there were only a handful of settlers remaining. They were skeletal, their clothes in tatters, their faces hollow. They stumbled onward through the endless trees, each step heavier than the last. Some whispered prayers, others muttered to themselves, their minds slipping under the weight of despair. Eleanor knew they could not go on much longer. Virginia was fading fast, her body hot with fever, her small frame limp in her mother's arms. She sang to her softly, though her own voice trembled with exhaustion. She thought again of her father, of the fort, of the message they had left behind. Would anyone ever know what had happened to them? Or would they too be erased like footprints in the sand?
The forest seemed endless. Days bled into nights with no clear sense of direction. The canopy overhead swallowing the sun so completely that even midday felt like dusk. The handful of settlers who remained moved as ghosts through the wilderness, too weak to speak, their eyes sunken and hollow. Hunger had stripped them of everything but the will to keep walking, though none could say where they were going anymore. Eleanor Dare carried Virginia against her chest, the child's small body feverish and limp. She could feel each shallow breath, each faint flutter of her daughter's heart. She whispered softly to her, singing songs of home, though her own voice was hoarse from thirst. Every step was agony, but she refused to stop. She could not. The group numbered less than 10 now. They moved silently, heads bowed, stopping only to collapse in exhaustion. They passed through abandoned villages, evidence of others who had once lived here. Burned-out huts, overgrown fields, pottery shards buried in the dirt. But they found no living souls. It was as if the land had swallowed entire communities, leaving only ruins in its wake. One by one, the settlers began to fall behind. The first was Thomas Nichols, who stumbled in the marsh and could not get up. They tried to help him, but he waved them on, insisting they leave him. Eleanor glanced back only once as they walked away, seeing his frail figure disappear among the reeds. That night, they camped in a small clearing, too tired to build a proper fire. Eleanor sat awake long after the others had collapsed, watching the trees. She felt eyes on her, the same oppressive presence she had sensed since they had left the fort. The forest was alive, listening, waiting. She was still awake when the crying began. At first she thought it was Virginia, but the sound came from beyond the trees. The same faint, distant wail they had heard before. Children's voices calling out, pleading, beckoning. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to wake the others, but her body was paralyzed with fear. She clutched Virginia close, willing the voices to stop,
but they only grew louder, echoing through the forest until it felt as though the trees themselves were weeping. When dawn came, 2 more settlers were gone. Their bedrolls were empty, their few possessions left behind. There were footprints leading away from the clearing, but no one dared follow. The group pressed on. By now, Eleanor knew that survival was unlikely. Her only thought was to keep moving until she couldn't anymore. She thought of her father constantly, imagining him sailing back across the Atlantic, arriving at the fort to find it empty. Would he search for them? Would he understand the message they had carved? The final days were a blur of hunger and exhaustion. One morning, Eleanor awoke to find she was alone. The others had slipped away in the night, taking the last of the food with them. She didn't know if they had abandoned her intentionally or if they had simply wandered off in despair. It didn't matter. She carried Virginia through the forest, her arms shaking from the weight. The child barely stirred now, her small breaths growing fainter. Eleanor sang to her, the words catching in her throat. She stumbled and fell, tearing her dress on the underbrush, but forced herself up again. As night fell, she reached a wide clearing. The moon cast pale light through the trees, illuminating the ruins of what had once been a village. Broken huts leaned at odd angles, their thatched roofs collapsed. A single fire pit sat cold and abandoned in the center. Eleanor sank to her knees beside it, clutching Virginia. She looked up at the sky, the stars flickering faintly above the treetops, and whispered a prayer. Then she closed her eyes and held her daughter close. No one knows what became of Eleanor Dare, or Virginia, or any of the settlers who vanished into the wilderness. Their footprints were erased by time, their voices swallowed by the forest. 3 years later, in August of 1590, John White finally returned to Roanoke Island. The journey back across the Atlantic had been long and fraught with danger, but White's hope had sustained him. As the ship approached the familiar shoreline, he strained his eyes for any sign of life. He imagined Eleanor running toward him, Virginia in her arms, the settlers smiling and waving from the fort. He had brought supplies, tools, reinforcements. He would save them. But when he stepped ashore, he found only silence. The fort was deserted. The houses were weathered and crumbling, their roofs caved in. Tools lay scattered where they had been left years earlier. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no bodies. It was as if the settlers had simply vanished. Then White saw the carving. On the gatepost of the fort, etched deep into the wood, was a single word, Croatoan. Nearby, on another post, were the letters C-R-O. White's heart leapt. Before he had left the colony, he had given specific instructions. If the settlers were forced to move, they should carve the name of their destination. If they were in danger, they were to add a cross. There was no cross. White was certain the settlers had moved to Croatoan Island, where the friendly Croatan tribe might have taken them in. He urged the crew to sail there immediately, but a powerful storm blew in from the Atlantic, threatening to destroy their ship. The crew, already weary from the voyage, refused to risk the crossing. They left the island the next morning, leaving John White behind with his unanswered questions. He never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. Over the centuries, the mystery of Roanoke only deepened. Expeditions returned to the island, searching for clues. They found pottery shards, gun locks, a few European tools buried in the soil, but no definitive answers.
Some claim to have seen English-speaking Native Americans with light eyes and European features, suggesting the settlers had been absorbed into local tribes. Others believed they had been massacred by hostile groups or wiped out by disease and famine. Theories multiplied. Some said the settlers had tried to sail back to England and were lost at sea. Others whispered of darker forces, that the land itself had swallowed them whole. The carved word Croatoan became a symbol of the unknown, appearing in American folklore for centuries to come. Even modern archaeological efforts have yielded little. Excavations at a site known as Site X, located inland near the Chowan River, uncovered artifacts that may have belonged to the settlers, but nothing conclusive. DNA analysis of local tribes has been inconclusive as well, unable to prove or disprove the theory that the English intermarried with the native populations. The forest has reclaimed the fort completely now. Tourists walk the trails of Roanoke Island, visiting reconstructed palisades and listening to guides recount the story. But the true fate of the settlers remains hidden. At night, when the wind rustles through the trees and the ocean's roar carries across the island, it is easy to imagine the final days of Eleanor Dare and the others, the cries of children, the distant drums, the footprints that led nowhere. No trace of Virginia Dare has ever been found. She was the first English child born in the New World, and her name, like the word carved into the tree, has become a haunting symbol of the colony's disappearance. 400 years later, the lost colony of Roanoke remains one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Every theory leads to another dead end. Every search uncovers more questions than answers. And as the Atlantic waves continue to beat against the Carolina coast, the story endures, unbroken, unsolved, and as elusive as the wind whispering through the trees on Roanoke Island.